Quickly before we start, I just want to go over just a few housekeeping items. First, if everyone could please mute yourself. We're blessed today that we have great speakers that are going to be wanting this to be an interactive experience. And this is something that we all want everyone to. If you have a question, please raise your hand. You can ask at the time, put the question in the question box. But with that said, we do want everyone muted if you're not talking, just so we make sure we don't get any feedback and while our speakers are presenting. Now, with that said, as I mentioned, if you're having any issues on your end, any technical difficulties, any issues with audio, hearing, please just put a message into the chat box to me or our administrative assistant, and we can help you out with that. And then also additionally, too, you can raise your hand, you can unmute yourself if you want to speak, and we're going to be doing questions and answers throughout today's presentation. But then also we'll do kind of a general Q&A session at the end as well. And with that said, this is good for continuing education points, which at the end of today's seminar, we'll also be giving you the code for that and also sending out to all attendees after today's webinar. So if there's no questions on those items, I have the honor of introducing our two great speakers today from DocUnlock. We have Mr. Ned Cartmell, and we have Jack Moberger. So, just to give you a little bio about who are our speakers, we have Ned. He's the co-founder of DocUnlock. Ned studied international trade at Georgetown, followed by an MBA at NYU. Ned previously served as the founder and leader of the data services team at Flexport, scaling to nearly 500 people and processing tens of thousands of customs transmissions each month. Before Flexport, he managed logistics for a tequila importer, bringing over most of their goods from Mexico, and he's fluent in Spanish as a result of the 5+ years of working in Guadalajara. And then we have Jack. Jack is the head of sales at DocUnlock, previously serving in industrial manufacturing and distribution finance roles at GE and Unilever, followed by a software go-to-market leadership at Algolia, the largest white label search engine in the world. With that, Ned, Jack, thank you so much for being here again, and I'm going to pass it over to y'all to get started.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Victoria. And we love the Laredo crew. I actually have my LLUSCBA pin on today, so excited to be here with you all. We have lots of friendly faces in this group. And we are excited to be here to chat all about creating great entry writing organizations. So Victoria, thank you so much for the kind intros. I just wanted to add one more reminder. The chat is up and running. I just sent a message into it. If you're wondering where it is, you should have gotten just a ping to see it. Feel free to say hi and let us know where you are right now. If you have questions, we're going to try and be nimble here. And if you throw it into the chat, or if you raise your hand, or if you come off mute during the presentation to ask, we are absolutely happy to answer those all through the presentation, as well as at the end, we'll leave a little bit of time for questions as well. And we've got plenty of assets and other things to share with you. So please feel free to get in touch with us after the presentation if any of this would be of use to you or your team. Let's go ahead and get started with our agenda. So we're going to cover quite a bit today. You know, this session is billed as really like a little mini MBA on managing entry writing organizations. And what that means is we're going to go a little bit into, you know, why those even exist. Where did entry writing organizations come from? What is the problem they're trying to solve? How do they solve that? And then we're going to talk a little bit about the goals to measure those teams, the building blocks, kind of the org chart of a great entry writing organization. And then we're going to talk about continuous improvement and sort of running a tight ship. So management frameworks, meeting structures, operational cadences. You know, this is content that we have spent a long time developing, and it comes, as Victoria said, from Ned's time running one of the largest entry writing organizations in the world at Flexport, which is, you know, by now a top 10, maybe top 5 forwarder broker that I'm sure many folks here are familiar with. But Ned ended up with a team of about 4. And I would just ask that as folks join, you guys come and turn on your mute. But like I said, please feel free to interrupt us with questions as you have them, or to jump right into the chat with those questions as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. And let's start with a quick history lesson, maybe an entertaining one, especially these days, for anybody who has been doing this work recently. So where did entry writings come from? Let's start here. we know that as customs brokers, a lot of what's happening is transacted over email, phone calls, documents, EDI transmissions, all kinds of sources. And as brokers, we understand that our job is to be creating and clearing customs transactions. But oftentimes, what that means is I'm waking up in the morning buried under a giant pile of communication, and I need to figure out how I'm going to turn all of that communication into the filings that I need to create. So I'm going to spend my entire day taking commercial invoices, packing lists, bills of lading, health certificates, PGA documentation, who knows what else, all kinds of different content. And I'm going to turn that into my 7501s, my 7512s, my PGAs, and my ISFs. And, maybe I'm doing all kinds of other different stuff, but at the end of the day, our job is to translate all of these documents into the transmissions that we need. And this is going to take hours because this is one happening all the time. We're constantly receiving content, and we need to turn that, we need to digitize it. We need to look up any kinds of classifications necessary. We need to compare references and transform things into things like census quantities. We got to figure out which PGAs we need to submit, and we need to get all of that added into our ABI. And for most brokerages, at some point, you sort of just come into the understanding that eventually, you just can't keep doing this yourself. It can't just be one person, can't be a team of brokers even. Some specialized need or specialized help is required to turn all of this content into entries at scale. And so, with that sort of, framing, the real end customer goals around an entry writing organization, we think they're really fourfold. So the first is compliance. Of course, every end importer, end customer relies on their customs broker for clearly proven compliance with all of the regulations necessary. And right now, it's never been harder to do that. We're all, I'm sure, keeping track of what's going on with IEEPA, with steel and aluminum, now maybe copper, letters going out to all kinds of different countries. There's never been sort of more of a need for help and understanding of what is going on in the world, and especially with US policy. Accuracy comes very quickly afterwards. So we absolutely must have precision with this data. Of course, there are going to be customs holds. There are going to be fines and penalties applied when you're not declaring accurately. We need rapid response. So especially now, when we've also got all kinds of questions on the consulting front, but of course, especially in Laredo, we know that we're dealing often with truck shipments. We're dealing with folks who are going to need entries cleared in just a couple of minutes because there's a guy waiting at the border, who is going to wait for that clearance to cross. And then complexity. A lot of the issues with customs come from the fact that you can't just necessarily make one very straightforward filing. You need to go and cross-reference all kinds of different rules, and folks are looking to have that simplified. So if I am an end importer, what are some of the things that I want to be saying about my customs broker? Sort of how do all of these goals materialize into the things that folks should be thinking about if you're running a great customs brokerage operation for them and providing the services they need? We know that they're going to expect review on documents. And unfortunately, we know that importers also make mistakes on documents often. So they're looking for that second layer of protection against the kinds of data entry errors that happen even before things get to the broker. We also know that they want the confidence that as things are moving around, you guys are going to be following and processing filings accordingly, leaving folks a lot less exposed to delays, fines, and penalties. And we also know that specialized effort, in this case, effort on all of these declared and creating these filings is going to be, way, way, way faster than if the importer were trying to do this themselves, do it as they're going about the business, operating in commerce. So let's talk a little bit about who these folks actually support. At the end of the day, we know that entry writing organizations are there as a support function for the licensed customs brokers in the operation. So one, we need to keep our customs brokers focused on the most strategic work possible. So classification, making sure the audit workflow works properly, customer relationships. Entry writers, at the end of the day, they're there to make sure that the customs brokers that you guys have are quarantined into the work that is most applicable to the experience that they have. Two, I think a lot of these organizations, they serve as kind of a talent pipeline. So entry writing is kind of considered the entry point to the licensed customs broker, career. And that talent pipeline becomes super critical, especially as you grow as a customs broker, because you're going to be relying on that as an opportunity to pull more brokers into your operation over time. And then traffic coordination. There's a huge amount of overlap between the kinds of folks that are processing entries and doing entry writing and the folks that are doing traffic clerk style work where they're looking for delays on shipments, things moving around. You really need to keep a keen eye on everything that's going on. It's kind of like an air traffic controller for all of these documents and folks that are moving throughout the process. So we know where these customs brokerage entry writing organizations come from. We know why they're sort of created. Why don't we talk a little bit about how we measure their success? And for this, I'm now going to hand off to Ned, who's going to talk about some of the objectives of entry writing organizations. And like I said, guys, please feel free to interrupt us or jump into the chat with questions. We are happy to break to answer some of these.
Awesome. Thank you, Jack. And thanks to all of you for having us here. So as Jack mentioned, in my previous life ran a large entry-writing operation, excuse me. And in that role, there are really three things that we wanted to be thinking about. Jack's alluded to some of them already. So these are going to be sort of the accuracy and compliance, the throughput slash speed, and then the cost to do this. So if you're thinking about these three things, you're going to be keeping in mind really everything that matters to a brokerage. Obviously, in customs, we need to make sure the accuracies are correct. That's really the first and foremost obligation of the company. And then, what happens from looking from the business perspective is that you're going to make money with every filing that you do. And so the more that you can do for a given unit of cost, the more successful you'll be, assuming those are all accurate. So if we're keeping these three things in mind, we should be successful. So let's take a deeper look at each of these in turn. The first, as we mentioned before, so the accuracy of the entries, right? There is, generally speaking, a right answer for what an entry should look like given a set of commercial documents that are used to produce it. And so one way that you can gauge the accuracy of the entries is just to audit entries that somebody's done. We had a team specifically focused on this work at Flexport. We take a percentage of all of the entries that were made and have experts in customs compliance go through them and make sure that each were done correctly. And the methodology is super simple. It's basically to produce that score, you're looking at, if you take 100 entries, what percent of that 100 were following all the rules, right? Made sure that the commercial invoice had the country of origin listed, that the valuation was done correctly, that the importer of record was listed correctly, that it sort of the entry that was made reflected the truth about what was imported. And one thing I just want to call attention to at the bottom here is we want to make sure that that is done right on the first try. That's really important. If you're having to come back and make changes later, some percent of those cases where you're doing what we call rework are not going to catch the errors that were there. So the lower the percentage of what we call that first pass yield, the higher the percent of errors that are going to make it through and not get corrected. And the next thing is that rework's just super expensive. So we're going to get into cost and speed in a minute, but having to come back to something that you've already done and correct it is a sign that there's an opportunity to make some big adjustments in terms of the cost and throughput of the operation. So that is compliance. We'll take a look next. I mentioned sort of throughput or efficiency. And so if you can think about, in this case, either the speed that you can do an individual filing, or I find this is even easier to measure for a given broker or entry writer in a given month or week or day, how many entries are they able to do. So that the second measure I just alluded to is the throughput. So given a unit of time, how many entries is an individual able to produce? And then the sort of flip side of that is that, looking at an individual entry, how quickly can that get turned around? We all know that there are really different time requirements depending on the entry type. The ocean entries are going to have a lot of time compared to an air entry or a trucking entry on the border where we are here in Laredo. I think, we're always under the gun. So 3 to 7 days feels very luxurious, probably. So it's really important to get these things to be able to do them quickly, right? That's speed at the top. The second row here would be thinking about, all right, if we've got 10 brokers in our operation and we're able to do, in a given month, we're able to do, what is it? Let's say, 1,000 entries. that would be 100 per broker per month. And what we see is out there in the world, most folks are in this 1 to 200 range. There's going to be a lot of differences in terms of the way the data is received that can impact this number. If you're getting super long documents, so there's lots of PGAs, or just sort of the importer's kind of messy with their documentation, this can be costly in terms of how many each individual broker is able to do. But averaging out, looking across an entire brokerage, we find most folks fit somewhere in this range, some a little below, some folks a little above. But if you're well above this 200, probably means you're doing something really right in terms of your operations or use of technology. And then, yeah, I wasn't sure if there's a question. I'm going to keep going, but please interrupt me if there is. We also want to be looking at the speed that you're getting back to the customer. So if something changes or you get just a question, we want to make sure that those we'll call tickets are getting responded to quickly as well. And CSAT is just a way of measuring the customer. So we'll go to the next slide here for the last measure, which is cost. This is really kind of a derivative of the previous slide. If you're doing lots of entries and you have similar sort of salaries to other brokerages, you're going to have lower costs. The cost for most brokerages is almost exclusively a function of salaries, and doing other things like real estate, or if you're using fancy equipment. But it's going to be 80-90% plus just the cost of your team. And so the more that you're able to do with a given team, the lower your costs will be. The one caveat that I want to make here is that accuracy should be considered as it relates to cost as well. Going back to that note we had on rework, if you're filing lots of entries that have mistakes in them that have to get corrected later, it's going to look like you're being very efficient, but in your cost, you're not going to be able to be as low as maybe you'd like to be. Again, giving you just a survey of what we see out there in the market. Most folks are on the very low end, sort of this $20 range. Frequently, we see folks, especially if you're doing kind of ocean shipments, and again, longer entries or those kinds of things, up above $50. So that just gives you a sense of what's out there in the market in terms of where folks are at.
Awesome. So that is a ton of context, right? So we've talked about where entry writing organizations come from. We've talked about what some of the customer facing goals are, what the customers are thinking about for these organizations. But then, what we're moving to next is really the building blocks of a great entry writing org. So how do we actually create these organizations? What do the organization structures look like? And how do we manage them effectively? So let's move into some of the foundational building blocks, and then we'll start to break that out into how these teams are built. So as far as the foundational building blocks, we're really going to talk about three sort of core tenets across these teams. The first is the process. So how is this organization actually going to function? What are the handoffs to other teams? Then we're going to talk about the personnel. So what is the team structure? What are the org charts? And then we'll talk about some of the platforms and the technologies across the suite of products that many brokerages are using to help some of these processes go a bit faster. So let's look first at just an example from sort of an average brokerage and what it looks like to process an entry. And this is called a mermaid diagram. Basically what this is looking at the factory up here at the top left, where we're finishing manufacturing and loading the truck, and we're starting to see those commercial documents move over to the broker. And the thing that I really want to highlight here, this is probably going to look a lot like what your teams are doing. What we don't love about this process is that there effectively are a whole bunch of processes right on the critical path. So the data entry happens. Then we're maybe sending some SCAC and trailer info over the trucker. Then we're matching documents and data, fixing errors, creating, the classification all in line. And we might be doing this for many, many entries all at the same time. So bottleneck one is document errors. So let's say you actually do receive documents from a customer. How quickly are you identifying whether there might be something wrong with that invoice or with that packing list or with a missing document? How fast do we know that happens? Because if we're 45 minutes into writing the entry before that actually happens, we're going to have a problem. We're going to have a ton of rework, and we'll have to get back to the customer and potentially even start over. Bottleneck two is data entry errors. So how many fields are getting directly typed in? There's going to be some ratio because no human is perfect, and they're always going to have some level of error. I know that's true of me personally. As we're actually creating these entries, there's going to be things that then get missed, and we're going to have to catch that later on audit and do a bunch of rework there. Bottleneck three, there is a ton of work on the plate of these individuals within the entry writing organization. So is that same person receiving emails, responding to emails, doing the data entry based on those documents, and then getting back to the customer, putting it all in the ABI, hopefully trying to keep everybody happy in the meantime? That's a lot of different tasks to manage and to shift to, and it causes quite a bit of rework as well. And then bottleneck four, how long does it actually take you to determine that there's something new, something strategic to do? So we've got a product with no HTS code, for example. We don't have this in our parts catalog. We have to go get back to the customer and figure out, is this a new thing? Have they classified it already? Do we need to help them to classify that? And all of these things are sort of being found. And to use the sort of manufacturing process analogy, the andon cord is being pulled here and the entire line is coming to a stop because we've just realized in the middle of trying to do this that we've got some new thing to address. And so we want to avoid this. We want to put ourselves into a position where our organization is really built to process things a bit more efficiently. So I'll hand back over to Ned to talk about some of the organizational structures that help with that, how they help, and then we'll sort of bring back the new chart that looks a little bit different than this once we've got that organization structure laid out in place.
Awesome. Thank you, Jack. So here is a sample organization structure that's going to have owners of all the different pillars that we suggest you be thinking about. These relate to some of the metrics we were just talking about a moment ago, and as well as some others we'll bring up. Before I dive in, if you I don't know how many people are in this slide. It looks like a dozen or so. If you run a brokerage that's smaller than this, you don't necessarily need to divide everybody up into different divisions. This is just to illustrate the different kind of functional areas or pillars that we recommend you think about. In many cases, these can fall under the same person. If you run a small brokerage, it can be one or two people. But this will give us an opportunity to talk about the different sort of functional areas that we want you to be thinking about. So we've got government compliance and governance on the left, productions, these are the folks writing the entries. One from the left, that's going to be the biggest one, typically in terms of headcount. Quality and Kaizen. Kaizen is a Japanese word, comes from the Toyota production system that revolutionized manufacturing in the middle 20th century. IT, hopefully you guys are all familiar with that, and then support we mentioned earlier. So we can go into some of the metrics that each of these folks will own, I think on the next slide. So slightly different order than we just went through. The production folks are going to be mostly focused on the productivity and how quickly they're getting stuff done. Compliance is going to have ownership over that accuracy rate, that's sort of filing compliance rate that we just talked about, and other things like rejections or audits or exams. We want to also have a QA function that's got responsibility for that first pass yield measurement. Again, that's the number of entries that were right on the first try, which is really important, meaning there's no rework. We also want to look at rework. Then we've got IT here, who's going to be focused on, we're eliminating data entry. Use something like DocUnlock could help integrate with us. Or if you have clients that do EDI, that's another way that you can spare yourself from having to type stuff in, which will save time. Also want to make sure your systems are running, everybody can reset their password or whatever they need to do to stay productive. And finally, we often find it's helpful to split out a team that's going to be handling inbound customer questions, tickets, and they'd be focused on how quickly they're able to get resolution there. That's typically something we see with the bigger teams, but we have found that to be successful in terms of keeping folks productive who are writing entries. So if we go back to, I think, the next slide, which will...
Yeah, so we've sort of laid out the organization structure here and how these teams have lines of ownership to each of these metrics. One note that we want to make just before we dive into each team individually and talk about sort of why it's there and what the impact of that team is. A lot of times, especially when we're dealing with smaller organizations, we see consolidated versions of these charts. So I just wanted to quickly, sort of illustrate that, this may be a good example of what a consolidated version of that first org chart you saw looked like. So, maybe the licensed customs broker is the owner, and they have these teams replying to or reporting to them, from compliance and governance to production to quality and Kaizen and automation tech. Maybe in some cases you've got, a consolidated quality team that's doing a little bit of audit and post-entry quality work. Maybe your senior broker or yourself, sort of fills that compliance and government seat. Maybe within the production pods, you've got the entry team, and maybe some of those folks go on rotation, to work the longer shifts, the 24/7 nights and weekend shifts. And maybe support and escalation is shared between those folks as you grow. But we do want to sort of lay out the fact that you can still assign these roles and these responsibilities as partial responsibilities, and that helps as you're building up to that larger version of that org chart. You start to fill the seats that you have to fill, and you start to hand off those responsibilities from places where they're shared initially. And I know that this is a big question that we often get from teams, is how, when I don't have these like massive structures and these massive teams and org charts, to play with here, how can I think about, sort of lining this up with the team that I have? So a couple of rules of thumb to really think about as you're building that organization. These you can think of as sort of span of control rules. So span of control, obviously a management term, just speaking to how different responsibilities are partitioned and how folks generally handle their management capacity. So the way that we think about it is, these org chart blocks that you see here, they can be thought of as almost like units of teams. And so they can be multiplied. You don't necessarily need to go create a whole new department every time you want to add a block to one of these individual swim lanes. And there's a good reason for that. We want to make sure that the responsibility and ownership and leadership of these swim lanes stays uncomplicated, so that you always know who you're going to address with a given responsibility. So let's talk about those. Generally speaking, we want to have about one entry supervisor per, 8 to 10 writers, and that can vary based on the complexity of the entries being processed. 10 writers would mean that you're largely dealing with pretty transactional volumes, that these are relatively simple entries. Maybe the strategic sort of management need is a little lower versus, 7 or 8 if you're dealing with highly complex work, and maybe your entry writers are a bit more senior, a bit more experienced in nature because they've got quite a bit of complexity to deal with on what they're clearing. Generally speaking, as we're adding auditors, we think of like a 1 to 12 ratio. What that means is that roughly you're going to be able to achieve about 10% file review without really burning out that auditing team. And you want to continue to scale that with the writers that you're adding. One licensed broker can oversee compliance for roughly about 40 entry writers. So, you start to see multiple brokers coming in as teams get much larger and multiple licenses. And then the automation squad, IT and support, there's 2 real responsibilities for these teams. One, I'm sure everyone is familiar with: setting up systems, managing your email, your inbox, your hosting, all of your technology products that you're using. But the other thing that you can think of these people as being is really like an analyst or sort of an in-house person to help your team understand where processes can be automated. Vendors are good people to reach out to, but at the end of the day, there's a trust issue because someone wants to sell you something. And also, you want to make sure that your team has the context about what you're trying to do to be able to architect some of those solutions. And if the IT team is too sort of understaffed or under-resourced, oftentimes they're just triaging technical issues all day and maybe don't have quite as much time to think about how much better things could be, if systems were to be improved. So at the end of the day, these are rules of thumb. Again, every brokerage is different. There could be some complexity or difference in the way that your process works that would lead you to apply different rules. Don't think of these as laws, but they are helpful rules of thumb. And Alberto, if I could have you go on mute, unless that's a question, that would be helpful. Thank you. So I got 3 you to sort of talk about each of the different tenets of the org chart that we've shown now. So we'll sort of go through and take a unit by unit look at why we've organized this the way that we have. And Alberto, if I could have you go on mute, and Ned, have you come off?
Awesome.
I'm
Yes.
sorry, Ned,
So,
before you continue, Miss Claudia Fonseca, can you please mute your mic? I have someone connected as EVS. Can you also please mute your mic?
Thanks.
Awesome. All right. Yeah. So thank you, Jack, for that great context. I think we'll just really underline the point that this structure can work at really any scale. So just for a couple people up to, at the end of my time at Flexport, we had hundreds of folks. And it's really just giving you those sense of proportions and areas of functional ownership to be successful here. So one thing that you do also want to make sure is that there's one person that this is all rolling up to who has what we called before, at my old job, basically a single throat to choke for the rest of the organization, that somebody's accountable for all of these different things. Often when you're having to trade them off against each other, so you really want them all to fall under a single person, so that, for example, you're not doing perfectly accurate entries, but only doing one per broker per month. That wouldn't work. And equally, it wouldn't work to do 500 per broker per month, but have them all have to get reworked. You really need all these things to fall under one person for that reason. And that's this idea of a single threaded owner. Let's keep going. I think we're gonna go through the rest of these areas of ownership. So we've mentioned compliance, production, quality and Kaizen, automation and tech, support and escalation. Again, these can fall in some cases under a single person. There's at least one or two that you'll want to try to split out if you can. But if you've got all of these things, again, the structure can work whether you're just a handful of folks up to hundreds. So let's keep going here. Yeah, these are the two that you're going to want to try to separate if you can. And that is because what you ideally would do is for the folks who are doing entry writing, evaluate them and perhaps even compensate them based on the number of entries they're able to do accurately. And if they're the ones auditing their own work, that creates a bit of a conflict of interest. So to get that accuracy score, ideally this is somebody else than the folks who are actually doing the entries themselves. For obvious reasons, that's why they don't let kids, grade their own essays in high school, for example. So let's keep moving here. IT, the world is in automation moving very, very quickly. Of course, we've all, I'm sure, read about everything that's happening in the world of AI, and you really want somebody that's able to keep up with that kind of thing. Also, doing EDI integrations with your clients where you can will go a long way to helping you get out of the business of managing emails and keystrokes and get into some of these other things that we were talking about earlier, accuracy and throughput and all those other things. So that is IT. And here we've got this concept again. I'll put in a plug for splitting out the work of responding to inbound customer questions and requests to belong to somebody else than the folks who are actually entering the data. If you're able to do that, that can free those folks up to get into kind of a flow state and be very productive. So that is this idea of a customer support escalation team. I think that's everything that we wanted to go through here.
Yeah, so as far as the org chart, the only other thing that I wanted to say here about the support escalation team is that usually speaking, like the reason that we've got a customer request or the reason that someone's reaching out is because there's some level of sort of strategic insight that's necessary to kind of move the customer forward. So, when we talk about rapid response brokers or client analysts, these are people who, again, this may be a responsibility shared by the senior broker. It may be broken out slightly differently on your team, but the idea is to really provide some level of access to your customers directly to the people who can help to answer those questions quickly. Maybe it's on the classification front that this is needed. Maybe it's on, sourcing or trying to understand alternatives as things change. But really, you want to keep that away from the team that's managing all of the data entry and keep that as close to, sort of an operational machine as possible so that those folks aren't distracted and looking for ambiguous answers that maybe would be known directly by the broker. So let's say all this is done and you've taken this org chart and you've sort of moved yourself into a position where you're able to operate this way. You'll remember from the initial slide that we showed that we had a very vertical chart of the process and that things were happening, sort of all on one line with a bunch of things sort of handled directly by the entry writing team. Ideally, if we've got our IT process set up, if our team is handling tools, that allow them to work a little bit more quickly. For example, a lot of ABIs will have. I know NetCHB and RB systems are very, very common. For example, in Laredo, these will have usability tools that help you to manage this stuff a little bit more efficiently. But at the end of the day, what we really want is that the entry writing team, is sort of leaning on a lot of that automation. And so their path becomes significantly shorter. They're dealing with, inputs that have already potentially been checked by a system that maybe has some access to some OCR, that documents are parsed and transcribed automatically, that documents ready for automation are moving directly into the system and hopefully showing up in your ABI ready to go with some of that data entry component already done. And then the entry team really is put into more of a position of an air traffic control where they're able to sort of review documents and transmit to CBP, which is still required for the customs broker to do. And then upon that being accepted, we've got that border crossing. But we've taken a lot of the load from the entry writing team. We've moved some of the support need directly to the LCB. We've moved some of the customer support and question handling away from these teams. We've put tools in place to help them to be a little bit more efficient in the way that they work. And thus they're able to handle, sort of significantly more volume. So how does this happen? How do we put ourselves into a position where some of these things are being done on our behalf? Well, that's going to happen with the help of the platforms that many of you will already be using, but we'll sort of go piece by piece into the major categories of platforms that can help your team with these processes. So we're going to cover, I would say, 6 of the most important categories. There are additional things that can be put in place. But I think that between these tools, you're generally speaking in a good position to handle, sort of modern broker departments. So first, non-negotiable, we absolutely need a filing rail. We need, the system that's going to connect us with ACE. That's going to be your NetCHB, your RB systems, your CargoWise, Magaya. There's plenty of providers in this market. They have different strengths. Some of them provide other TMS capabilities. Some of them provide drayage. Some of them provide access to systems that you need on the customer's end. And selecting the right ABI for you is going to be a really, really critical process. We need something for file storage. So backing up our files, maybe the ABI handle this, or maybe it's handled by a system that is external and sort of independent. Ideally, we have something handling document processing to remove as much of the data entry as possible and really put us into a position where we're not just typing things from one document into another document. As far as internal communications, we'll need things like messaging and workflow management. And external communications, we should be dealing with email and document receipt systems. There are, Stacy, if I could have you go on mute, please. We do have classification systems that are starting to be used by some brokerage. I would say this is a newer category and one that some are experimenting with now, but there are some very nice solutions for getting research done on your behalf that you can then use to make classification decisions. And we know of some if folks are looking for platforms like that. And then process analytics. You want to be reporting on your efficiency, on your throughput, and you want to be looking at these numbers on a very, very regular basis. So let's go deeper into each of these and talk about some of the things that we need to be looking at within these platforms. So for the filing rail or the ABI, first, we absolutely must have a UI that for users actually feels usable. So, a lot of these systems look like very, very complex forms and they've got all kinds of things within that they can be used to be customized. But we want something cloud native. We want something that we can log into from anywhere that we need to. There are IT systems that you can put in place to make that possible. Ideally, we also want some level of EDI or XML upload capability. Not every customer is going to be willing to shift their process to an EDI-driven model, but for the ones that are, receiving that information electronically is really going to allow your team to speed up and hopefully limit the number of documents that you need to be transcribing. Third, and I would say this is one of the most important, but often one of the most overlooked, a lot of ABIs don't necessarily have modern integration systems. And as we sort of move into this new era where there's all these other tools that you can potentially plug into your ABI, you really want to be selecting one that provides a modern interface for other systems to communicate with, because that's what's going to unlock your ability to either electronically notify the customer of certain things or to receive things from the customer or from other systems. This is different from just an EDI capability where somebody maybe uploads a file and the system goes and finds it. This is really a direct interchange or direct back and forth with the ABI. NetCHB, RB systems, and others provide great tools for this. And if your ABI does not have it, it really limits your ability to look into sort of additional solutions that can help. And then fourth, there are some usability features within ABIs that are really critical. Great templates for trade parties, great templates for parts and parts databases. Oftentimes PGAs can be templated within these systems to allow for those to just be triggered based on the presence of a part. Some systems allow you to automatically update IEEPA tariffs based on the fact that something's coming from Mexico or coming from China. And this is really going to limit the amount of time that your team needs to spend manually inputting data. Second, and obviously very important, is communications. So ideally, we want to be able to communicate with our team, anywhere at any time. And so we want to make sure that we've got systems that are capable of doing that, something like a Slack or a Teams, a messaging service that we can use to communicate internally. Ticketing systems. So this is things like, an integrated email system that allows you to share an inbox between multiple people. Sometimes folks will start on a Gmail or an Outlook, and then they'll move to a shared inbox system like a Zendesk or others that allow you to have multiple people looking into these inboxes at the same time. You can manage this with distribution lists, but some automation can be built on top of these systems as well. So for example, if we receive an email with a certain subject from a customer, that triggers a workflow, which then builds, potentially a project that we start working on that then eventually becomes the entry. Workflow management tools that can allow you to connect your support and internal comms channels. So for example, to trigger a Teams ping to an individual because something that they've been assigned has had activity, from the customer. And all of these systems should allow for delegated access levels where you're able to see the parts of these communications that you need to see, but maybe not the parts that could impact compliance if you do not need to be seeing them. Next up, we have file storage. So housing your backup files for your entry writers and for your audit purposes. We definitely want something very secure that gives you gated access to files and compliantly stores your data in the US only. We need that system to be integrated with your ABI, with your email, with your workload management platform. So lots of modern file storage systems are able to allow you to shift files between those systems very easily. Again, we want a modern UX. If you're just logging into some, home-built file storage system, oftentimes that can increase complexity. And there are lots of systems that do this extremely cheap. Again, we can provide recommendations across any of these to the extent that folks are looking for examples. And then we want connectability to automation platforms, because if your file storage system is able to, sort of be triggered to do things by other systems, that means that it can potentially pass files directly to the ABI, or maybe directly to an OCR system, or to, your audit software as it's running through and looking for the backups for these platforms. Next up, we have document processing. This is maybe not the newest category, but a newer one that has had a lot of progress recently. This is also where DocUnlock lives. So these are systems that are not just OCR. Ideally, you've got a system that's processing your documents with a little bit more rigor than that. It needs to be integrated with your ABI. It should be able to read what's in the email from the freight forwarder or from the importer. You want not necessarily to have your team going and logging into these systems on a regular basis. So it should be able to complete a lot of those checks without necessarily being overseen individually by a person. And then we want some robust process checking, right? Some self-corrections, controls. Maybe it checks, for example, that the invoice actually does tie out, that the total value is equal to the sum of the component parts. Maybe that the same house bill of lading number is found on the invoice, on the packing list, and on the arrival notice. There's lots of different things that you can use these systems to check for. But the biggest thing that we should say is that, when it comes to file scanning and sort of taking these fields and transcribing them into your ABI, you don't necessarily want something that just sees a document that it's only seen once and then returns those files. So you need to really understand the connectivity of the documents to the filing. And that is going to allow your team to move a lot faster. Again, this is what we do. So if anybody has any questions on this particular topic, we're happy to go deeper into it. Classification, I would say this is maybe one of the most controversial. We're starting to see brokers experiment with this, but it is an AI-powered, set of systems that are out there. There are tools like Gaia Dynamics and others. Trade Insights AI is another. But effectively, what we want, not necessarily is something that automatically classifies our goods, but that provides us instead with sort of like a deep, detailed research report on its reasoning for classifying goods. Many of these systems, they won't just give you one output that is an HTS code. They'll actually give you the reasoning, the rationale, the parts of CFR that it's paying attention to, and really giving you a solid backup that you can then use to make that decision quickly. And for folks who are dealing with hundreds or thousands of new goods on a regular basis, this is really critical, because that otherwise is going to be hours and hours of effort, potentially on a per product basis if things are different enough. And you want all of that justification and research to be done for you. And this is what AI is really good at. You don't necessarily want it to be making those decisions without a person in the loop. That's where you start to run into customs business regulation. But there are systems that can help with this. And then process analytics. So, the easiest version of this maybe looks like an Excel spreadsheet or a Google spreadsheet. And we'll share a version of this that you guys can use to get yourself started if you don't have great tracking across these metrics right now. But eventually you can think of systems like Power BI, Tableau, Looker, and others that can hook right into the systems you're already using. Some ABIs are going to provide really good tracking capability for how efficient things are. And if you can get those metrics out of those systems and into these ones, it puts you into a position to be looking at a report every day or every week that allows you to very quickly react to process efficiency issues. So with all of these sort of foundational components in place, you put yourself into a position to automate things a lot more efficiently and with a little more, I would say, compliance oversight than is often assumed. You can really string these together to the point where they're able to put you into a position to react to issues as needed and not just lean on automation completely. You can still be that sort of air traffic controller who's looking for all of the places where attention is needed and focusing that attention only on those places. So now that we've talked about platforms and we've talked about people and the organizational structures and why all of those are built, let's talk a little bit about how we keep it all together. And then we'll pause at the end here so that we've got a little bit of time for questions from folks in the room who have anything to react to from the presentation so far. And again, as that final reminder, you can also drop your questions directly into Slack so that we can see them there. Let's talk about that cultural glue. So, when you've got these pods built, these teams created, we want to make sure that folks are getting a great work environment and that they're, put into a position to succeed because they've got access to management resources that can help them. So, as a sort of bare minimum weekly one-on-ones, and this is one of the reasons for the span of control being limited to, maybe 7 or 10 entry writers per supervisor, eventually it consumes more of the week than you're able to dedicate. But we want to make sure that you're, sort of using a personal version of a KPI board. And this is an example, by the way, of one of those. So, maybe I'm looking at the, time to file, the files processed, the entries per writer, my compliance stats. All of this is, something you should be able to react to at least, I would say, on a daily or weekly basis, if not per shift, if you're running things a bit more structured. And, you want to take that board, you want to review it with the people on the team, and you want to see where the bottlenecks live for that person individually so that you can help to unblock them and sort of develop them personally and help them turn into, sort of the best version of the writer that they can be. Daily 10-minute stand-ups per pod. So when we say per pod, we mean by team. And the idea here is that you start the day looking at the last day's production and understand sort of what happened, what were any issues that we might need to address or to adjust our process in order to do better. Quarterly, we say usually you don't want to do this a whole lot more than quarterly because it can be, a distraction eventually. But ideally, you're taking a week and you're maybe giving a good chunk of that week, maybe an hour a day, for your writers and the people who are thinking about your process to really collaborate and think about the next ideas that may help you to run a more efficient operation. So your team is going to have the most context on what all of these issues look like. And if you're able to put those people together with leadership and with process and IT and really have a dialogue, you're going to be able to solve those problems in a much more sort of tailored white glove way for your organization. And that's going to help quite a bit. And then as far as the media diet, the last thing we're talking about here, as you hire entry writers, these are some of the most junior people in, the world of logistics. Getting up to speed is really, really difficult. And so you want to maybe give them a set of things that they can use to build their own internal context on what the process looks like. We have our own sort of media diet list full of podcasts and articles and people who write great insider reports. NCBFAA and LLUSCBA obviously provide resources like this. But you really want someone to be able to sort of almost like binge watch the most important content across the ecosystem and across the industry. And again, we're happy to share our own version of this with anybody that we give to new employees that they can learn to get up to speed and understand what's going on with customs at a high level, and then the things that they should follow to make sure that they're staying on track with all of the changes in this market, of which right now there are many. So as I mentioned, we're more than happy to share the KPI template or the media asset with anyone who would like it. Feel free to take a screenshot of this slide, or after the meeting, we will follow up with the attendees so that you guys have access to all of these resources. But of course, we're happy to share this. And that sort of concludes the structured part of this presentation. We've got about 10 minutes here at the end for questions on what you've seen so far. So I will break there, and if anybody would like to either come off mute or jump into the chat, you can go ahead and do that, and we're happy to answer any questions on what you've seen so far.
Okay, y'all, this is your time for questions. We have the pros here with us. So if you have a question, please unmute, ask away, or put it in the chat box, and we are happy to help you out. So to give y'all a second while y'all are thinking about it, I just want to reiterate that one, we will be sending out to all attendees the PowerPoint from today's presentation, and then also the continuing education code. With that, I'm going to quickly read it, and then again, we will be sending this to you via email as well. The code is NEI-07-2025-6-GLHX.
And I've also dropped that continuing education code directly into the chat if anybody wants to copy it from there. But of course, Victoria will send it out to everybody after the presentation as well.
And okay, any questions?
Quiet crowd today. We have seen all kinds of different iterations of these organizations. So even if it's not related directly to the presentation, if you guys just have a boiling problem on your hands, we are more than happy to talk through how other folks that we have seen have solved those, or how Ned solved them previously at Flexport. But definitely don't be shy, guys. We're more than happy to jump into any topics related to entry writing or running a customs brokerage generally that can be helpful to your team.
Hi, Jack. Luis Martinez. Quick question. One of the biggest challenges that we face in our entry writing department is training and getting them up to speed on the CFRs and knowing what HTSs mean, what country, and how that all translates into the final 7501 entry. So I'm going to be completely transparent. I've had people leave the entry writing post because they feel like they didn't get enough training. What do you suggest that I can implement as a training I don't know, platform or some sort of a book? I have no idea. I mean, I'm not looking for a magic cure-all, but I just want to be able to write my training manual a little better and as a broker, I mean, my training manual is in the CFR, but I want to give them a little bit something easier to digest. Thank you in advance.
Yeah, great question. So I think just first, before we even launch into like how you solve this, I think this, I'll acknowledge, has gotten way harder over the last year. Obviously, there's a lot more regulations to pay attention to. Things that would have had one code now have 3 or more. So there's just a sense in which this has gotten harder. I think it's okay to acknowledge that. What I would say there's lots of ways you can approach this. It is a meaty topic, and there are actually quite a few companies, including some really good ones out there, that do essentially like licensed customs broker prep courses. Some of them are not too expensive, and I think in some cases you can just get the materials. I don't know if you've looked into that. That might be as like a really quick and ready solution. I'm happy to recommend some. I'll need to do some research after the meeting and look up the ones that I've seen before. But that might be, in terms of something like is a quick win in terms of getting up to speed in the CFR. That's what these exam prep courses cover, and it's fair you having to put together a course. So that'd probably be my suggestion.
Yeah, and I just add two bits to that. So, like Ned said, there's organizations, NCB, FAA has the NEI organization. There's Global Training Center, which I know is associated with quite a few great courses for exam prep. I would also say, Luis, like you sort of have to create the hunger initially by allowing someone to have enough context to be able to sort of like understand when something's changing, when it's new, when they're just getting their first baseline. And so some of those introductory courses and CFR prep course and customs prep courses are extremely helpful. But I can't, sort of like emphasize enough how important it is to help folks understand sort of like at a broad level the history of the logistics industry. There's a great book that's called The Box that sort of gives a developing history of logistics and in particular international ocean shipping. But they sort of tell the story of how that market developed, why the port systems look the way they do, where this all came from. And sometimes having a bit of history to place things in just gives you a little more context on what to do. There's also a whole list of really, really helpful. I prefer podcasts and audio just because you can kind of consume it whenever you want. But there's a whole list of really helpful sort of overview trainings that are already recorded. I've seen, some podcasts from folks like Scarborough and others who have sort of like gone out and put out that first hour of some of those sessions that help you to kind of just get your thoughts straight. And then more so to the ongoing, changes, we're constantly getting CSMS notifications right now. And there's, we also know that there's a lot to follow between, an executive, sort of branch announcement, maybe even just a Truth Social post to eventually we get some kind of an informal version of that where there's actually an announcement that comes from the government. And then, customs then has to respond to that. And that's a lot to keep track of too. At the very minimum, I recommend sort of digesting internally what's going on with all of the new CSMS notifications and what's changed and allowing people to kind of follow that thread. This is getting easier and easier now. You can feed some of those announcements directly into, for example, like some of these LLM systems where they can then digest and say, okay, here's what's changed. Here's the HS codes that it's been applied to. You can go all the way to automating the production of a full newsletter. But at the very least, I'd sort of recommend helping people digest what is changing on a weekly basis right now, because so much is changing. But this is a really big answer. There's a lot of things that we've sort of both touched on. So just to kind of summarize, first, you really want people to understand logistics as an industry. And if they're moving from, a place that isn't necessarily giving them that background, they're going to feel lost in the narrative of what's going on. And so when you can place things in that historical context, it's helpful. Then you want them to be able to see, a huge variety of content that ideally they can listen to and just kind of get a digest for what the last few months of activity have looked like. And that's where those historical podcast lists can be really helpful. There are external providers that'll help with some of the introductory content. And then most importantly, just kind of keeping up with the CSMS notifications. I know NCBFAA is always putting out articles that help to digest those, as well as folks like Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg. But like I said, Luis, we're also happy to share with you our list of sort of like media to follow. And you may see from us some notifications around things like newsletters for the upcoming changes in the future, because we have seen lots of people who are just struggling to keep up with those announcements. Hopefully that helps a little bit.
Great question.
Thank you.
Great. Does anyone else have any other questions? Going once, going twice. Okay, well, I think that is going to wrap us up for today. Thank you, Jack and Ned, for coming. This was a great presentation. Thank you, attendees, for joining us. We will be sending out the PowerPoint as well as that NEI code in the email list to all of the attendees today. If you have any follow-up questions, Jack, is it okay if we share y'all's contact information as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. We will include that in the email as well. And again, thank y'all so much. Have a great rest of the day, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.
Great. Hope to see you next time we're down in Laredo, and appreciate your time today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank y'all so much. Thank you.